Hi, I'm Jason. Welcome to my workshop and welcome to part 2 of a 3-part series where I build a shaker-inspired table designed by Norm Abram of the New Yankee Workshop. It's made of solid cherry, and in the first video I made the legs for the table. We made the mortises on a router table, and I showed you how to make the tapers on the legs using a tapering jig. And that's as far as we got because I had to make an emergency run for some lumber and they didn't have exactly what I needed, so I had quite a bit of milling to do. I had to resaw some of the thicker boards into thinner boards. I had hoped to do that on my bandsaw. As you can see, it is kind of dead at the moment. I'm waiting on a part so I can repair that. I actually talk about that in another video where I show how to resaw using a table saw. So if you want to, you can watch that video. That's also here on my YouTube channel. Today we're going to be working on the top for the table. Now I've got 3 boards that are roughly milled to size. This morning I spent some time on the jointer getting 1 flat side and 1 square edge on each of the boards. So I'll now take the flat side of each of those boards and I'll run it through my planer with the flat side down. So I'll get these to final thickness, which will be 3/4 of an inch. And then I'll spend some time figuring out layout, trying to orient the grain pattern the way I like it before I glue those up. So first thing I need to do is mill these to their final thickness. So I spent quite a bit of time at the planer this afternoon milling the boards for the top of the table to 3/4 of an inch. And I think it worked out pretty well. My planer has 2 settings on it. One is for dimensioning and one is for finishing. And that finishing setting speeds up the revolutions of the knives, so you're getting more cuts per inch as you run the boards through. And what happens is you're left with a really silky smooth finish on these it's just beautiful. I don't think I'm going to have to do much in the way of sanding at all. I've also spent quite a bit of time thinking about the layout of these boards, figuring out which way I want the grain to flow. I've got the grain pretty much flowing all in the same direction. The thing with cherry I've found is the grain tends to take little detours here and there. So I've come up with what I think looks best for these boards. And so I'm just about ready to glue these up. Before I do that, I'm going to be cutting for some biscuits. Now, biscuits are football-shaped pieces of beech that are used for alignment and also adding a little bit of strength to the joint. You use something called a plate joiner. Some people call it a biscuit cutter or a biscuit joiner. And you plunge it into the piece and this blade comes out and cuts a semicircle slot for the biscuits. So there's the slot, and then the biscuit just goes in like that. So you do one in the edge of each board, and then you push them together. It helps with alignment, and it also does add quite a bit of strength, at least in my experience. There are some people, a lot of chatter on the internet, people saying biscuits really just aren't necessary. You get plenty of strength in the glue joint. I agree with that. You do get a lot of strength in the glue joint, but I've made a lot of cabinets, a lot of tabletops using biscuits, and they haven't failed me yet. I see no reason to not use them. So I'm going to go with what works. So the first thing I need to do is start cutting some slots for biscuits. Okay, so I've made some marks every 6 or 8 inches or so for each of the biscuits, and I just strike a line where the joint is so that I'll know exactly where the biscuit slots need to be on each of the boards. So I'll do 1 board at a time, and I'm just going to flip this so that they're facing me, and I'll take my biscuit cutter and I line up this red line with the line that I drew on the board, and I just pull the trigger and make the cut. So now I just lay a bead of glue all the way across the edge of the board, and I make sure to let a little glue fall into each of the biscuit slots. So now with the biscuits in one side and the other side glued on the edge, I just push the 2 pieces together and tap them a little with the dead blow hammer if I need to. And I want to make sure that my pencil lines are aligned. And now I'm just gluing and assembling the third board to the other two boards, and then I'll put everything in clamps. Just make sure when you're clamping, you don't apply too much clamping pressure. You just want a nice, even squeeze out line. You don't want to squeeze all of the glue out of the joint. And instead of wiping the glue off, I'm going to let it set in the clamps for a little bit until the glue starts to get a bit rubbery, and then I'll just scrape it off with a putty knife. So it's been a few days since I've been in the shop working on this table. The last thing I did about a week and a half ago was get this clamped up, the top of the table, and just got it out of the clamps tonight. It's just been a crazy week at work, and I haven't had much time out here. And if you're wondering about the hat, I live in Minnesota, and for the last 2 weeks, we've had sub-zero temperatures. And a couple of nights it got down to 20 and 25 below. So it's just been insanely cold, and even though the shop's heated, there's a couple of cool spots here and there. And I don't have much hair on my head, so hence the hat. So anyway, one thing I forgot to mention last time I worked on this was this triangle I drew with a piece of chalk. I think they call that a cabinet maker's triangle. It might be a carpenter's triangle. But what it does is it helps me realign the boards when it's time to put them back together. So, you know, once I made all my marks and I got my layout the way I wanted it, I had to pull everything apart so I could make the biscuit slots and so forth. And then when I put it all back together, I wanted to make sure that I got everything back together the way it was before I did all that work on it. And so that's what the triangle helps me do. So this is looking really good. It's nice and straight and flat. And all I really have to do on it is some sanding and cut it to final size. So I'm going to set this aside for now, and I'm going to start working on the sides of the table, also called the rails. We'll do that next. So in part one of the series, I spent some time rough cutting the front and rear rails and the two side rails to size, leaving them a little bit oversized. And I did some preliminary milling to try and flatten the boards a bit and get them closer to their final thickness. Right now they're at about 1 inch thick, all of them, and they need to be at 3/4 of an inch thick. And because they've been sitting in the shop for a few weeks now, they need some more work at the joiner and planer, so I can get them nice and flat. Then I'll do the final cross cutting and ripping on these, and I'm going to do something really cool with the front. You're going to want to see that. So my miter saw extension wings have a really cool feature, and that's this flip down stop and this tape measure built into the wings. So what that allows me to do is I can make a squaring cut on the end of each board. These are the rails, and then I can flip each one end for end and flip my stop down, which is already set at the length I want, and then I push that squared edge right up against it and make my cut. And I found this to be a lot more accurate than trying to use a tape measure and draw a square line or trying to rely on the saw's lasers or anything like that. By the way, no New Yankee Workshop project would be complete without the obligatory flannel shirt, so Norm, this one's for you. Speaking of the project, so we are going to work on the front rail right now. So there needs to be 2 drawers in the front, and they're overlay drawers. And to have the grain match all the way across, we have to cut this a special way. Now, what Norm calls for is to actually make a couple of rip cuts in the board and then have some blocks. So there'll be 2, 1 on each end, and then a block in the middle. 1, 2, 3. And then what happens is this board shrinks in width, leaving you with a couple of drawer fronts that are wider than the openings will be after I've glued and assembled this. So we need to make our rip cuts next. So we made a mistake. Shocking, I know, right? So here's what happens. This front rail is supposed to start out slightly oversized, and then you make a couple of rips. So you rip away the bottom piece, which is 1.25 inches wide, and then you rip away the top piece, which is 1 inch wide, and you're supposed to be left with the center piece and then make some cross cuts so that you're left with 3 filler pieces, left, middle, and right, and then 2 drawer fronts, one for the left, one for the right. Well, because I ripped instead of cross-cutting first, my drawer fronts are too narrow. The filler pieces are the right width, but the drawer fronts are not. Not a big deal. I can fix this. It'll be an almost invisible repair, and the grain will still be flowing the way I want it to. What I'll do is I'll just take this waste piece and I'll make my cross cuts, and then I'll biscuit and glue the parts back onto the drawer fronts. It'll be an almost invisible repair. You'll never know the difference. It'll be our little secret, okay? So I gotta do all that, and then we'll get back to building. Okay, so I fixed my little boo-boo. The drawer fronts are in the clamps, and I think it's gonna be just fine. So here's what I'm left with. This is the front rail for the table with the 2 drawer openings. And I need to cut some slots for biscuits and glue all this up. I've got the bottom piece, the top piece, the 3 filler pieces, and when I put them all together, the grain flows just like I want it to. And you also want to double check and make sure before you do all this that the drawer openings are actually the correct dimensions. One other mistake I made was that I made the drawer fronts a little bit too short. So I've got to, not much, just a little bit. So I've got to shorten up these openings so that I'll be sure and have a perfect 3/8 of an inch overlay all the way around the drawer fronts when they're installed. Okay, so I've got everything in the clamps, being careful not to over tighten, got a nice even bead of glue squeeze out. Looks like I may have applied a little too much glue over on this end, but not the end of the world. So we'll let this cook. I'll let the glue turn rubbery and I'll scrape it off, and then we can move on. So I'm not gonna lie, I left the shop a little depressed last night, and here's why. I tried to make those repairs to the drawer fronts like I talked about, and the glue line is just not perfect all the way across. In some spots it's totally invisible, in other spots I can still see a faint glue line, and I also see it on the center filler piece on the front rail, especially on the bottom right here. It seems to be fine on the ends though. So I had considered scrapping this, but I thought, you know what? I'm only building this for my house, for my wife. It's gonna bug me every time I walk by it, but she'll never notice it, frankly. And then I did this, and it really lifted my spirits. Speaking of spirits, these are mineral spirits. And I just wiped some of this on to see how it's gonna look with some oil-based finish on it. And it's just gorgeous. I mean, the cherry figure just pops. Yes, I still see that faint line, but your attention is drawn to the grain and just how beautiful the wood is. So I don't think it's gonna bother me as much as I think it is. So I'm gonna stick with these, and we're just gonna move on. The next thing I need to do for the rails is I need to mill a couple of dados in the back, and that's gonna be for the drawer supports and also some corner blocking to keep everything square. Okay, I'm in a much better mood now, and that's because I get to use one of my favorite tools, a router table. Any opportunity I have to make dados on a router table versus a dado stack and the table saw, I do it because it's a hassle setting up the dado stack. You've got to mess with shims and try to dial in the perfect width. Here I know I'm going to get the right width because I'm using my plywood cutting bit, which is slightly undersized from 3/4 of an inch. I'll be using plywood for the corner braces and also the drawer supports. And so we're all set up here with the router bit. I'm gonna make 2 shallow dados running the length of each of my rails. And I wanna make sure I do that on the ugly side of each piece. In this case, it's this size because I can see a little bit of sapwood. Nothing against sapwood. I know a lot of people like sapwood, but I'm not one of those people. So I'll turn on the dust collector to the router table and off we go. All right, so I finished all the dados and it went fine, and I've swapped out my router bit to a beading bit because I need to route a decorative bead on the bottoms of each of these rails.